Good afternoon, Eastern Washington. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from the front lines in the battle for freedom and liberty, Olympia, Washington, and brought to you once again by the committee-elect Matt Shea, Republican, and the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news. Once again, it's not about right or left. It's about right and wrong. And our hope is not in man, but in Jesus Christ. And we can't end in prayer. We must also move to action. And as Ephesians 2:5-6 says, quote, God made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. And raised us up with him and has seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. And quote, what a promise that is. Everything that has been put under the feet of Jesus Christ has been put under our feet. If we are in Christ and Christ is in us. And are we acting like it? You know, are we walking around defeated? I was telling a group of folks the other day, you know, when we say that we're Christians and we act afraid, we're not really living out our faith. When Scripture says that we can move mountains if we have faith, and mountains are a picture of government in Scripture, that we can move governments, we can change governments if we have faith. And it may not make sense. We might be totally outnumbered like Gideon was. We may be hiding in the wilderness, as in the times of Elijah. But if we have faith, those governments can still change. That is important. And it's something we need to hold on to, something we need to act out in our faith. I love the opportunity to meet a challenge head on, and I'm going to talk about a few here coming up. But meet a challenge head on and be able to watch the Lord work in a miraculous way. Which brings me now to your daily intelligence briefing on the international front in the Middle East. The Palestinians. This coming to us from Deb Kafile, essentially issuing an ultimatum to Donald Trump. Choose between a Palestinian Jerusalem or war. And the problem is that Mahmoud Abbas understands that he is now against a well-ordered, Arab-backed U.S. peace plan there. In other words, he is going against the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the United Arab Emirates, and realizes he's losing. And so he is saying, essentially, there must be a Palestinian Jerusalem or there'll be war. So, as we've been talking about on this show, this really bodes ill. War clouds truly looming in the Middle East, but also the continuing situation in Syria. Secretary Tillerson very, very clearly saying that U.S. troops are going to stay in Syria. 4 players jockeying really in Syria right now. You have Iran and Russia, and you have the United States and Israel. And the Israelis did airstrikes also in Syria over the last couple of weeks. But more importantly, Trump made a big move on January 12th when he asked Europe to agree to overhaul the Iran nuclear accord on enrichment and ballistic missiles. So it looks like they're going to try to reopen that horrific Iranian deal that happened. It wasn't really a deal as much as it was a capitulation. But again, things looking ominous in the Middle East. Also on the international front, I talked about those Israeli airstrikes in Syria. I also talked about the fact that the first true drone battle in military history occurred when some drones attacked a Russian airbase and a Russian naval port, Tartus. And the Russians took control of 6 and took down 7. So the first true drone battle has occurred in the Middle East, and I just think we're going to continue to see more of it. And I'm going to get to a little bit of this here in a second. because there's a huge move toward not just artificial intelligence, but automated everything. And you're going to be shocked at one of the things that we actually talked about on this show over the last couple of years finally was admitted by a Microsoft executive. I'm going to get to that here in a second. But first, I want to follow up on the international front in North Korea. Show of force by the United States in the Pacific, the Olympic Games looming, and you just see tension mounting. The Chinese army is expecting an attack by the United States on North Korea. They're bracing for it. So things very, very tense there amid the Olympics. And on top of that, and this is kind of an interesting thing, because you don't hear a ton about this, but I got to wonder if this isn't a strategic ploy by the Chinese. Now, this article coming to us from sciencemag.org, and you can take a look at it. It's coming out of Cincinnati, Ohio. Underground labs in China are devising potent new opiates faster than authorities can respond. In other words, the Chinese are coming up with drugs to flood U.S. markets and Western markets, and they're doing these synthetic opiates faster than we can react to them. Are these truly underground labs, or are they sanctioned by the communist government? I have a hard time believing that the communist government is going to allow underground labs to flourish, those drugs to be made, then shipped without knowing about it or without having some hand. I just find that kind of hard to believe. But that said, they're claiming these are underground labs, and that the United States consumes 85% of the world's natural and synthetic opiates. And so it just begs the question, are the Chinese doing this as a strategic ploy? I don't know. But that kind of layered on top of everything else, I think it continues to add tension, especially in that area of the world. On the national front, and this is the article that's just so stunning. Now, I have been recommending everybody listening to Patriot Radio go get the movie Surrogates. It has Bruce Willis in it. It's an older movie, but it is the direction that we are headed in our future. If you want to know what we're going to look like in 10 to 20 years, watch the movie Surrogates, and it's very startling. And we're not just talking about, General Motors coming out and saying, hey, we're going to have electric, or we're going to have automated cars by 2020, like we've been talking about on the show. I get that part of it. There are going to be automated cars. It's going to happen by 2020. You're talking 2 years out. But this is another step. Okay, so we talked about the fact that drones will be delivering packages to our houses. In fact, the folks that are advocating a water bank in Spokane County are advocating the use of drones, and that every property owner needs to give an aerial easement under this new water bank system. And drones will be used to do geospatial analysis of your property to find out how much water you're using. Now, understand what an aerial easement means. So everything under 1,000 feet, right? You're talking about flying very close over your house, okay? But I will just continue that you're going to see drones in everything. So shipping, government regulation, and monitoring. You're going to see drones for passengers, literally flying drones that are going to take passengers places. You're going to see drone plane transports, entire 747s that are drones flying goods from one part of the country to the other, or maybe even internationally, via drone. You're going to see cars, like we've talked about, being driven by a computer. But then, take this to its logical conclusion. You're seeing this proliferation of these so-called sex bots for people too. Well, where does this stop? And that's what the movie Surrogates kind of answers. Microsoft years, everyone will have an artificially intelligent robot alter ego that will know everything about them. That robot alter ego is what is depicted in the movie Surrogates. So think about where this could totally go. You could live a life in your home and never go outside your home because you got your robot alter ego that's going outside of your home for you. Folks, this is where it gets kind of, we're challenging the very notions of humanity at this point. And, you know, some people say, oh, you know, InfoWars, just read the primary source document. I mean, the guy said it. So they brought it up, and I think it's worth a discussion. When does artificial intelligence and robotics and artificial, robot partners and vehicles that are autonomous, all this stuff, I mean, where do we lose our humanity? Where's the line drawn? For one, I don't want to drive in a automated vehicle. I like to drive. I don't want to drive in an automated vehicle. I want to be able to have a steering wheel, control the car. But there are some people out there that don't want to live that way. They don't want to have any pain whatsoever in their lives. They want to have everything done for them. And we got to be careful that the attitude in our culture doesn't continue to facilitate that, and we accept those attitudes into our families. Also on the national front, 485 scientific papers refute, quote, consensus on climate change. And those papers, 485, were published in just 2017. This coming to us from Faith and Freedom. Gary Randall also has a show on ACN. But anyway, Kenneth Richards just published a story. Essentially, there is no consensus. It's crumbling. And I think everybody knows that. If you really wanted to address so-called greenhouse gases, you would actually manage your forest better. 92 million tons of carbon dioxide that are released in Washington per year, 24 million tons of it come from catastrophic wildfires. And that was the wildfires 3 years ago. So the greatest thing we could do to have cleaner air, the greatest thing we could do to help create jobs, the greatest thing we could do, if you believe in greenhouse gases as affecting the earth, to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, is to manage our forest better. It just makes sense. And there really isn't an answer. There really is not an answer to that. Also on the national front, Southern Poverty Law Center. Now people are and Tom DeWeese of American Policy Center has been on the show many times. They are calling for a congressional probe of the SPLC. And I say about time. You want to talk about socialist collusion? Gracious. Southern Poverty Law Center has lost all credibility, and they do need to be investigated. Also on the national front, Operation Condor. This is what the name is being given by an author online. I posted this up on my Facebook page. But this was the use, allegedly, of NSA assets to monitor because he told Trump that they were being monitored in Trump Tower. I mean, this is unheard of in American politics. I think this is the big scandal. I really do. Between this and Hillary and the real collusion with the Russians, with Uranium One. I think these are the scandals, and they need to be investigated. And I hope Congress takes this seriously and does open up investigations into this. Also on the regional front, well, we're here in session. This week has been a packed week. Now, some people were getting a little bit upset because I wasn't answering my messages or emails or texts quickly enough. Folks, we're getting between 1,000 and 1,500 emails, text messages, Facebook messages, phone calls a day. It is very difficult to keep up with that volume. So I want to make sure that everybody understands it might take a little bit to get back to you. Doesn't mean your issue is not important. It's just the volume that's out there. And this is, by the way, the schedules in Olympia, for those of you that don't know, we're on essentially 15-minute meeting schedules all day long until into the evening. And so it becomes very cumbersome and difficult. But on the positive side, this week on Monday we had a pro-gun rally on the steps. It was well attended, and I appreciated the folks, Rick Halley and others that were helping out with that. And it was great to see bipartisan, and you heard that right, attendance and speakers. I think there's a lot of people out there that want to protect the right to keep and bear arms. Also, the next day, we had the first annual Keep Faith in America event in the Rotunda. And at that event, we had prayer and we had broadcast on Facebook Live, bringing prayer back to the Capitol in a very big way. And for those of you that don't know, January 16th is Religious Liberty Day, or Religious Freedom Day. And so it's very important, I think, to keep faith in America, keep religious liberty going. And Judeo-Christian values have allowed for other views. It really bothers me when people say, Christians don't want to hear another. It's been Judeo-Christian values that have allowed all those other views. It's when you bring in things like Sharia law that all the other views are closed down. It's when you bring in socialism that all other views are closed down because they can't compete. And Christians, honestly, just like our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ believes, that there needs to be a choice. He's not going to force you to choose him. So all the evidence is weighed, etc. There's an open debate about it. And it just makes sense. So we're going to be doing this event every year. And the following day, we actually did a vaccine freedom rally as well, talking about just simple things that should be happening where parents can know about the fact that their kids can go to school and they don't have to be vaccinated. Did you know that? Did you know there's an exemption for them? And then just today, Donald Trump's administration announced that there is going to be a department created on conscience and religious exemptions regarding vaccinations. It's amazing. And hopefully I'll be reporting more on that next week. Also, I want to highlight a couple things. House Bill 2422, which is the high-capacity magazine ban. So any magazine over 10 rounds, essentially, they want to ban it. Also, House Bill 2738, it's effectively a concealed carry ban. Now, you heard me right. This bill would require expressed permission from every property that you step onto with your concealed carry. So you'd have to carry apparently a binder around with you or something, effectively banning concealed carry. So these two bills clearly don't have a lot of support right now. Even there are Democrats that don't support these. But I'm bringing these to your attention so that they stay that way, bottled up in committee. This morning, actually this afternoon, I voted no on a safe storage bill, which essentially is just a way to prosecute people after the fact, after tragedies. And this type of thing of dancing around the edges on the gun control debate, trying to turn law-abiding citizens into criminals it's ridiculous. And I very clearly believe that it goes against Article 1, Section 24 of the state constitution, which says The right to bear arms shall not be impaired. Impaired means what it means in English, plain English. Gracious. Also on the regional front, this morning, a bill I had called, it's House Bill 1128 on arbitration limits, was passed out of the House with a broad bipartisan vote, I think 77 yes votes, and was sent to the Senate. This would actually help small businesses by raising the mandatory arbitration limits to $100,000, allowing most property disputes, contract disputes, etc., to be settled through arbitration, which is much, much cheaper for small businesses, and it's much, much faster. So that was kind of a big win today. Also, want to go through some of the tax stuff that's out there right now. There's a sugar tax, an income tax, a carbon tax. They did away, the Senate did, with the two-thirds rule, with the two-third vote requirement to raise taxes. They did away with that rule in the Senate. Now, look, there's not a lot of support for an income tax. The Supreme Court has ruled it's unconstitutional several times here in Washington State. They keep trying it. So I don't see that flying. I also don't see flying the carbon tax. Not a lot of Democrat support for it, even though the governor spent 3/4 of his State of the State address on that issue. There's just not. And people don't want to have their gas, their price for a gallon of gasoline raised 20 cents. Now, there's going to be a property tax increase coming up, too, as part of that whole McCleary fix that happened last year. So, I mean, imagine yourself, I guess, at the gas pump. You decide to open your mail, and you get the property tax increase. And at the same time, the carbon tax has your gallon of gas raised 20 cents. And you're sipping on a soda because they also have a sugar tax, which would be essentially 24 cents on a 12-ounce can of pop. And you're doing all this, and really what's happening is you have a vacuum cleaner in your back pocket just for doing normal everyday stuff. So that's what happens with one-party control in Olympia. When the Democrats get control, that's what happens. It's a dramatic change for the business community. It's a dramatic change for all of us. And people say, oh, the business community. No, those are people. These are people that own businesses. They're people, just like me and you. But clearly, they're becoming a cash cow for some of the people in downtown Seattle. Well, also on the regional front in session, tonight, there is expected to be a vote on the Hearst fix and the capital budget. I cannot give any other details than that, but I will be doing a Facebook Live update after we vote on those bills tonight. But we will be voting on a Hearst fix and a capital budget this evening. Expected that vote is coming up here, I guess, at about 5:30. We're supposed to be back on the floor, so as soon as I get done with the show. So please say some prayers and tune in. You can go to my personal Facebook page, and it's a public page, so even if you're not my friend on Facebook, you can still view this stuff because it's public. Go check out the Facebook Live when I do the update tonight. And I hope that you're satisfied with what I'm going to have to say. So, well, thank you very much, too, for everybody that is supporting me and my wife while we're in session. That is the briefing, but it is so refreshing to have so much prayer and well wishes and, hey, we're here for you. It is very hard to be away from your spouse, for a week at a time, for then months. It's just very difficult to do that. So thank you for everybody that have been sending me text messages and stuff saying, hey, we're praying for you, we're thinking about you. Just means a lot. But do remember that the antidote to dependency and socialism is to be a God-fearing, self-reliant, freedom-loving American. Make sure that you go to Facebook/Patriot Radio US, like the page, share it with your friends and family. And also, if you get a chance, send me an email if you want at matt@voteshea.com. And just if you have any ideas or issues, I've been having a lot of people come up with ideas and stuff that we're turning into bills. So if you have any ideas or issues, just send it to me and we can turn those things into something good. I mean, it's just amazing, at least I think, how much citizen involvement can change things. It's really, I don't know, I'm excited when people call and they're like, hey, have you thought about this? Whoa, no, I haven't. And I'll highlight a couple other bills that we've been dropping too. Talked about, vaccine exemptions. Talked about having just some basic things like informed consent to go through, some of the problems with vaccinations, to require that the levels of aluminum and mercury in vaccines match the federal guidelines for cumulative dosages. All those kind of things, and we're working on those and go through kind of a summary next week, I hope, with Representative Taylor when we get a little bit of a breathing room. But anyway, today it is my pleasure to introduce my good friend Dave Workman again to talk about some of the gun issues that we're battling here in Washington State. Dave, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing okay. It's raining, pouring outside where I'm at, and I guess this keeps the air clean around here. So,
well, let's talk a little bit about the status of things. We were in Judiciary today. They voted out the safe storage bill. It's just, what's your take on some of this stuff? You've seen a lot more than I have, but this just gets kind of frustrating after looking at this time and time again.
Well, in all the years that I've been covering the gun issue in various publications, including the Gunmag, where I'm senior editor, I've seen this kind of thing come and go. Washington is not the first state that has had legislation like this. And this certainly isn't Washington's first rodeo with this kind of legislation. I know that this kind of legislation, when I talk to people who support it, I suppose their intentions are good, but it's never really explained to me what they think they're really going to accomplish. And I think that bugs a lot of the gun people. And I talk to firearms owners every day. They send me emails. I talk to them on the phone. I go to the gun show on weekend in Puyallup once a month. So I talk to these people. They're my readers. I really do understand their thought process. And this kind of legislation leaves people scratching their heads wondering, well, okay, we'll do this, but what are we going to accomplish? What are we going to stop here? Because criminals, they tell me, and I tend to believe this, don't obey the law to begin with. You can pass all kinds of laws, and to them, the criminal element is just going to laugh and go on their merry way. All this does is affect the law-abiding gun owner.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the safe storage bill. I mean, it's kind of a gotcha bill because it's not intended to really prevent anything as much as it is to allow prosecution after the fact. I mean, this seems like it's kind of adding insult to injury.
Well, yeah, and there was an argument last year, or maybe it was the year before when this came up, and I can't even remember who it was I interviewed, but it was the impression at the time was that, gee whiz, somebody breaks into my house, steals my firearm, uses it to commit a crime, and I get prosecuted for that as a crime victim. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. I know people who they have no children in the home, and maybe they live in a rural area where they want to have a firearm close at hand. They want to have it ready to, shoot predators maybe, or maybe even shoot a deer off their back porch, and yet those people are just as subject to being criminalized as anybody living in an urban environment. Now, I was a firearms instructor for more than 30 years in my off time, and certainly I support the idea of storing firearms safely. You don't just leave loaded guns laying around all over the place, because that's just an example of being stupid. But not everybody will want to have a gun safe or a security locker or maybe a gun lock of some kind on their firearm, especially at night when they may need it right away in a bit of a burglary. And this kind of legislation, what I get from the gun owners that I talk to, is just what you said. It adds insult to injury, and it's an after the fact kind of a thing. It gives a prosecutor an opportunity to maybe spread the blame and go after some gun owner who really didn't commit a crime. He's a victim of a crime. And I'm not too sure if that really is going to accomplish anything, except maybe to disqualify one more gun owner from being able to own a firearm.
Well, it really does seem like that's what they're trying to do, is just absolutely clamp down on not just the number of gun owners, but where you can actually carry a gun. And that brings us, I guess, to House Bill 2738, which is effectively a ban on concealed carry, because it requires express permission from every property owner everywhere you go when you're carrying a firearm. I mean, that's beyond ridiculous.
Well, this state has a history of concealed and even open carry. And frankly, when somebody wants to prohibit the legal carrying of even a firearm on public property, and then they want to make it impossible for you to carry on private property, the bottom line here is they're trying to discourage citizens from exercising their state constitutional right to bear arms in defense of themselves or the state. They can pass that bill. I'm not too sure if it's going to wash if somebody would file a lawsuit. And, that's something that may be over the horizon, too. A bill like this, I think, maybe it might be a lot for show. It's to demonstrate to the core voter group, the liberal anti-gunners, that, gee whiz, we're trying to do something, but the legislature just wouldn't do it because they're in the grip of the nasty old gun lobby. And I did a story last night for an online column I do for a publication called American Handgunner, in which we talked about it's kind of a dilemma. The anti-gun lobby, according to a report out of Oregon, spends a whole lot more on political races and supporting different politicians than the so-called gun lobby has ever spent. Michael Bloomberg, he vowed to spend up to $25 million, maybe even more than $25 million to affect elections this year. I don't know if the NRA's got that kind of money. I certainly don't have an extra $25 million laying around. That's going to be an interesting story to watch.
Well, and especially since these are the guys that have nice security contingents that follow them all around, armed, of course, right?
Well, yeah. In fact, there was a piece, I think it was in the New York Times here a couple of years ago, and I may be mistaken, it might have been another publication, but I read it with great interest because it gave me some insight into how Michael Bloomberg thinks. He hired a bunch of the same detectives that used to provide him protection when he was the mayor of New York City. He hired them in retirement to be his private security detail. All these guys carry firearms, and unfortunately, the average citizen does not have the ability to purchase his own private security, so he's got to carry a firearm instead. He might want to leave a firearm at home with his wife when he's off working, or maybe when he's called to duty to deploy overseas. There's all kinds of things in here that really are fundamentally wrong. If when you're looking at the disparity between people like Michael Bloomberg, who've got boatloads of cash, and the average Joe Blow citizen.
I look at some of these things, and it very clearly looks like they're trying to target people that are low income, living in high crime areas, because that's who's the greatest. I mean, that is who is affected the greatest by these types of things. Single moms, all these folks that want to protect themselves in high crime areas, and yet when you add all of these different pieces of legislation together, it always adds up to a higher cost to buy a firearm. Always.
Yeah, and I think you're on to something there too. And I've read various op-ed pieces. I've even written a few op-ed pieces over the years about this very thing. The Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, the state constitutional provision, which is Article 1, Section 24, it doesn't discriminate against people of low income. It doesn't say that you have the right to bear arms, but you only have that right if you've got $50,000 in the bank. It's fundamentally wrong, I think, when you take measures, when you pass measures that really discriminate against low-income, elderly people. And I'm not a 25-year-old spring chicken anymore either. In fact, I'm past the age of retirement. But I'm still in this business because, one, it's fascinating to me, and two, I don't like eating cat food. But it's a situation where I think you're right. At the end of the day, when you see what the ultimate result is of some of the legislation that has been proposed, not only here in Washington State but elsewhere around the country that I've written about. It's the low-income person, the single moms, the people on fixed incomes, the retired persons. They're the ones who are most affected by this kind of legislation.
They always are. And then you have some of these other ideas that are out there, some of these other bills that are out there, like this high-capacity magazine ban. And then also what I think is the more egregious one, and that is they're trying to take the situation that happened in Nevada and turn that into a trigger modification ban, but that could affect everything. I mean, that could affect most firearms. I mean, every man that I know that I hang out with as a friend of mine, you buy a car, you want to put a little bit more on it, right? Well, it's the same with a firearm. You want to make sure that you have a nice trigger. You want to make sure that you have a good piece of equipment, and they're going after that too. So if you can explain to the listeners a little bit about the implications of some of this.
Well, yeah, and in fact, when I was down there covering the rally last Friday, you were there, and you probably recall how Senator Fortunato got up, and he started explaining some of the fine print that was in, apparently it's been removed now, but it was originally in that legislation on bump stocks. It didn't just cover bump stocks. If somebody had a target pistol, for example, or a target rifle that he's had trigger work done on to improve the performance of that firearm and maybe even improve the safety features, that could become illegal if this legislation had passed in its original form. Those are the things that really bugged gun owners. In fact, there was a guy down there, I talked to him, and I've got a great quote from him. He said, you know what, the trouble with all of this legislation is it's written by people who don't know a darn thing about firearms. And as a journalist, when I hear people say that, and I've heard them say that for years, it starts to sink in, because more often than not, when I talk to people on the other side of the fence, and I've interviewed several gun control people over the years, it strikes me that they have a horrible lack of knowledge and understanding about firearms. They just don't like them, and they want to write these laws to get rid of them one way or the other.
And that really comes down to, the fundamental question: do firearms actually stop more crimes than they are used to commit? And the answer in every legitimate study that I've seen is yes, that is true. Firearms are actually a good thing to have, and it makes society more polite.
Well, I did a book a couple of years ago. Well, it's been more than a couple of years ago, but it was called America Fights Back. And I wrote that with Alan Gottlieb, who is actually, in addition to all the other stuff that he does as a gun rights guy, he's the publisher of a magazine that I'm the senior editor of called Gunmag.com. We wrote this book, and it detailed all kinds of self-defense incidents around the country. And I talked to a guy named John Lott. He's a professor of economics, actually. And he's done some, I think, remarkable research on guns and crime. And he wrote a book called More Guns Equal Less Crime. And that was an interesting book. I read that a couple of times. I use it as reference material sometimes. But it does apparently prove, or it offers evidence anyway, that in areas where you've got high rates of gun ownership, the crime rate goes down. And what really contributes to this is when some bad guy gets shot by a law-abiding citizen. It's not the best choice. Maybe it's not, certainly not the first thing I do is just plug somebody when they come through the door, but in a situation where, say, a pharmacy is being robbed, or a 7-Eleven, and you see these videos all the time on social media where some thug comes in, pulls a gun on some poor guy, and the poor guy pulls up his own gun and shoots this individual, the crime rate tends to go down. People tend to leave those people alone after they've shot somebody. And, like it or not, there seems to be a certain sense about that sort of thing. Bad guys who are recidivist criminals do not want to mess with somebody who might shoot them. That's as sensible as I can put it.
Right, and we've talked about this point before, that one more bureaucrat is not going to stop bad people. One more permit is not going to stop bad people. One more ream of paperwork is not going to stop bad people. One more ban on another plastic accessory is not going to stop bad people. One more law is not going to stop bad people. It's always going to be armed, trained people that are good, that are going to stop bad people. And it really has always been that way and always will be.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You probably know who I'm talking about. A guy named Dory Monson's got a radio show here in Western Washington, and he talks about this sort of thing, and he has mentioned a few times on the air how strange it is for the city of Seattle to want to create safe injection sites, or at least one safe injection site for heroin addicts, and yet at the same time the city of Seattle is all in favor of all kinds of gun control, where the law-abiding citizen is going to be fairly well defenseless if they're disarmed. And I guess the bottom line question here is, whose side are these people on? Is it the good guys who pay the taxes, or is it the derelicts out there? And I can't answer a question like that. I don't know.
Well, it certainly is, a topic for discussion, no question about that. And I really see the continued push at gun control as, going into the foreseeable future. Every year we're going to be facing this, and that means every year citizens need to be involved, they need to be engaged, they need to be educated. Otherwise, the moment they turn their back, those rights will be taken away by, or at least I should say trampled, because truly our right to bear arms comes from God, not from government. But they'll at least be trampled by some of these bureaucratic strictures. So how can people get involved? I mean, what is your recommendation for folks that want to get involved and want to stay eternally vigilant, especially on the right to bear arms?
Well, first and foremost, I tell people this all the time, you've got to vote. You've got to register to vote. You've got to make darn sure that you do vote. That's really, I think, the most important part of citizenship in this country. One time, actually, when I was changing jobs, and they had actually hired a guy to replace me at a very small weekly newspaper, the change was coming right in the middle of November, and it was election day. So the kid calls me up, and he says, I'm going to be a little bit late. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, I have to go vote, because he lived in a different precinct. And I said, you don't worry about being late. You make sure you vote. And that, to me, is the fundamental part of citizenship. Now, I know that the gun rights groups would say, well, yeah, join our organization, join the NRA, for example, or join and support the Citizens Committee or the Second Amendment Foundation. That's all well and good, too, and belong to a local gun club or firearms organization, too, because not only do you get politically involved, you learn about safety. They're always reminding people about gun safety. They've got programs to teach new gun owners, to teach kids. That's, I think, very important, too, and pay attention to what goes on in Olympia. And you guys down there in Olympia have a toll-free hotline where citizens can call and leave messages for their legislators, don't you?
We absolutely do, and I'll put that out here when we get done at the end of the show. But I really appreciate your take on all of this, and also, you write for the Gunmag. Can you plug a little bit of not just that, but also Second Amendment Foundation? How can people kind of get involved in some of these other organizations as well?
Well, each one of these organizations does have a website. You can join anything online these days. I know the National Rifle Association has a very busy website. The Second Amendment Foundation has its own website. Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms has a website. And I know that you can take out a membership in all of these organizations online, and being fair play here, I know the gun control organizations do the same thing. I've been to some of their websites. You can sign up actually and join these things online. That's, I think, part of this big puzzle too. And while we're talking about this, I don't know how much time we've got, but I'm going to play journalist. I'm going to ask you a question. We've been talking about all the gun control people and the gun control issues that seem to come up year after year. What do you think motivates these people? You're down there with them. You rub elbows with them, every day during the session. What's going on with these guys?
Well, I will tell you, it has been my observation that, especially when I've talked to a few of these people, there are some true believers. They believe if all guns are eliminated in the whole that are in places with beady little eyes, plotting destruction and chaos, and that's just part of the world that we live in. That said, there are other people who know that the right to bear arms is important if this country is to remain free, and their agenda is exactly the opposite. Their agenda is actually to intentionally tear down the Constitution of the United States of America, the state of Washington for that matter, and to replace our republic with essentially a socialist or communist government. And those people are there, and that is, I think, is a fairly well-documented fact, actually. So I kind of have to be... There are some that I think they just believe in naively that's, the world can be made peaceful. Then you have others that are really intentionally evil, I believe, and they're trying to take away the right to bear arms so that things like happened in the late 1600s, 1700s, 1800s in Ireland when the British took away the right of the Irish to keep swords. And you have death and destruction and misery and a potato famine and prison ships. That's what happens when people are disarmed, and they know that, and they want to see that actually happen. They want to see people subjugated, and I know that's hard for some people to believe, but there are people out there like that, and I've met some of them, and they are open about it if you get to talking to them.
Well, as appalling as that sounds, I've run across people who occasionally actually, they actually do indicate that. And years ago when I was in college, and I went to the University of Washington, got my journalism degree there, I was talking to a guy about this sort of thing, and I said, well, what you're describing here sounds like just a dictatorship. How do you think you're going to square that? And he said, well, I'm going to be one of the people in control. I thought about that for about a nanosecond, and you're crazy, because that's really not how this is going to work. It's, I think, a credit maybe to so many people who want to get into public service. I write for a living, and I'm fascinated by it. I fell in love with journalism when I was in my 20s, back in the Watergate era. And I stuck with it, learned some of the tricks of the trade, and really became, I think, more involved than a lot of news people would like to admit they are, but, they are. And I thought to myself, geez, here's a situation where a lot of people who push this agenda, and it really is an agenda. You see it every day down there, where you've got a ruling class or an elitist class, and then you've got everybody else out there. The everybody else is the people I write for. I remember when I was in J school, I had a professor in there, and he says, it was one of his first lectures, and there were, I don't know, a couple hundred kids in this room, and he said, look, the job of a journalist is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I've never forgotten that. And maybe that's carried with me all these years. I look for situations and people who maybe want to abuse their authority or abuse their position, and I ask questions. My beat is gun, so the questions that I ask always challenge some of the things that are being said in favor of gun control. I use the FBI uniform crime statistics constantly, because they demonstrate that we're not awash in blood. We don't have a horrible crime problem out there. About 60%, if not more, of the firearms-related deaths in this country in any given year are suicides. In Washington State, that goes up to about 80%. And, we're not talking about passing laws that are going to prevent people from taking their own lives. Because, if somebody's determined to do that, believe me, they're going to do that. We're talking about passing laws that only affect law-abiding citizens who wouldn't break the law and who'd never dream of hurting themselves. So, here we are in this quandary.
Yeah, here we are. Well, we've got a couple minutes left. You've been down there a long time, and especially monitoring all the different players in this. Where do you think that they're going to get any of these gun bills through? From my perspective, I don't hear a lot of support, but I would like to hear yours.
Well, I've got some sources, and they're pretty good sources down there. And it's my impression that maybe the bump stock ban is going to pass. The rest of this legislation, it was introduced. They've given it, or they're going to give it public hearings, and that's probably where it's going to stop. After all, we are talking about an election year, and I think that there are a lot of politicians, especially in the swing districts, who don't want to risk having the gun owners come out of their typical slumber at election time and decide to fill out a ballot and send it in. You'll recall back in 1994, after Congress passed a couple of nasty gun control bills, Congress changed hands. More than 50 members of Congress lost their jobs in the election of 1994, including Tom Foley, who was the Speaker of the House, and he was the congressman from Spokane. That is just unheard of. It's the first time that it had happened in 100 years. And the gun owner vote out there is always like this sleeping giant. Conservatives want to depend on it every 4 years, get them roused up to help elect Republicans or conservatives. Liberals want to keep them asleep so they don't lose their jobs. It's a simple matter of sitting down and doing the math. And it may be a good show. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that a lot of this isn't theater, so that the well-financed anti-gun lobby based in Seattle will have another excuse to put another ballot in or initiative issue on the ballot.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, Dave, I really appreciate you. Dave Workman, the Gunmag. If you get an opportunity, I'd like to just touch bases with you. Next week, there's a hearing actually on Thursday. Most of the gun bills are going to be heard in the House next Thursday in Judiciary at 1:30. I'd love to just chat with you real briefly and maybe get you on Facebook Live as well, right outside of the hearing room.
Well, actually, I'm not going to be in town. I'm going to be on assignment all next week at the annual Shooting, Hunting, and Outdoor Trade Show down in Las Vegas. And that is going to really take all of my time, and I apologize for that, but it's part of the job. It's what I do. When I get back the following week, I'd be delighted to chat with you again, because by then some of the dust will have settled, and I think we're going to be able to see a little bit more to answer your question, what's going to get passed and what's not this year.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to it. Dave Workman, the Gunmag, thank you once again for joining me on Patriot Radio. Keep up the great work, my friend.
Thank you.
All right. I want to end the show today real quick. Some breaking news out of Congress. Congress votes to reauthorize the FISA system and mass surveillance of even law-abiding U.S. citizens, unfortunately. Also, want to clear up something. So, again, there's going to be a hearing next week, 1:30 Thursday, in Judiciary on the gun bills in the House of Representatives. Also, this weekend, I am going to be in Colville, Washington, 3 o'clock on Saturday. Colville, Washington this weekend, 3 o'clock on Saturday, at the 51st State Rally at the Fairgrounds there in Colville. You can't miss the Fairgrounds. I look forward to seeing everybody there. May God bless all of you, and may He make this generation the greatest one.